Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good, straightforward topic for you today. Let's do it. People who work in morgues or with the dead, what's the creepiest thing you have ever experienced? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Funeral director here. About 15 years ago, I had a lady whose husband passed from a terrible motorcycle accident. When she came in to make arrangements, she mentioned that she wanted his leather jacket back. Not terribly uncommon for people to want personal effects back. However, in this case, the jacket was ripped and torn and saturated with blood and had bone fragments embedded in it. Personal effects from the coroner's office are usually returned in a sealed bag. The second it was given to her, she took it out and put it on. It smelled terrible. I truly hope she's doing okay now. I work as a motor vehicle collision analyst. We get called to fatal vehicle collisions and reconstruct what happened or caused the collision, provide analysis, and provide courts with expert testimony. I've seen a lot of deceased persons and animals. I've seen almost every wretched way a human can die in a collision. However, there is one that stays with me every fall. In late October, I get called out to a fatal single vehicle accident. The driver was traveling through a shallow S-curve, but going too fast. She was not able to negotiate the first turn, and her vehicle enters into critical velocity. The wheel buckle on the passenger side, and she rolls. She was not wearing her seatbelt, and through the first roll was partially ejected out of the driver's side window. Her skull was crushed between the outside of the door and the road, and continued to flop, partially ejected, as the vehicle rolled. The skull was split from her left eye to the right rear behind her ear. This caused her brain matter to be strewn about the road and car. Her body was eventually thrown from the vehicle and came to rest on the side of the road. One aspect of the job requires an inspection of the bodies to look for evidence. I approached the body that is facing upright on her back. The skull was very open, and I could clearly see the inside cavity of the skull with no brain. The brain was deposited in chunks on the road and has a distinct smell. This scene didn't bother me at the time. I was more fascinated than anything at the time. A few hours later, I get a call from my wife just asking how the day is going. I told her I was on scene and couldn't talk too long. She then asks if I will be working late tonight or be home on time, because tonight we were going to be carving pumpkins with the kids. Years later, I still can't carve pumpkins, and kids have no idea why. I work with a lot of hospice patients, so death is a common occurrence in my field. One night, when one of my patients had literally just passed, the phone rang. It was the daughter, hundreds of miles away, who had never checked in on Mom the whole time she was in my care. She sounded panicked and asked if Mom was okay. That timing always weirded me out, because it really seemed like she somehow knew something happened with her mom, who near the end was confused and constantly insisted she needed to find that daughter. I completely believe in that some type of subconscious connection to siblings or parents. I've seen it happen myself, so yeah, something to it. I watched two young children's corpses fry with electricity. We responded to an electrocution. A fault caused electricity to be traveling down the stabilizing cables of the electrical pole. A little kid touched that cable and got shocked, causing his hand to grasp tighter. His little buddy must have seen it and grabbed him. By the time we got there, they were both dead, but still electrified. We couldn't safely approach until the electricity department cut the power. So we sat there and watched these two little bodies twitch and spark. It's like a horror movie. Had a gig doing overnight transport of dead bodies. Think black suit, white shirt, black tie, unmarked black van, and boss made us wear white gloves. He wanted us to look high-end. Needed to transport a recently deceased middle-aged woman, breast cancer, 250 miles in the dead of night from a hospital morgue to a mortuary near her extended family. It's been a solid 2 hours of total silence when the corpse lets out a low wail. Sounds like, I about shit myself as I swerve off the freeway and spray out a rooster tail of gravel and dirt. Even though, intellectually, I knew this is just stomach gases escaping the body, I couldn't help but be a little freaked out. I was part of a search and rescue for 3 years. I was in the scuba team, so we were responsible for finding the usually dead people at sea. The salt water adds so much horror to a body, not to mention the fish that usually will start picking on a corpse sooner than later. My creepiest experience was trying to find the body of a Jane Doe was missing. She was a prostitute against her will, brought over by human trafficking. Turns out, she slit her wrist parallel to her veins and jumped into this rocky and sharp outcrop into the sea. We went diving in less than ideal conditions. It was low visibility and waves. My scuba buddy and I were looking at an outcrop when suddenly, out of the darkest, a deep blue hand emerged from this little cavern in the rocks. It began twitching and moving, and as we tried to pull the hand, the rest of the corpse emerged. She was being picked on by moray eels, hence the twitching, which emerged with bits of human flesh in their mouths. Her mouth was wide open in a scream position, and her eyes were gone. You could see tendons and bones in her hands, and the sharp rocks tore her entire body to shreds in various spots. Her toes were mostly gone too, with some bits of bone sticking out. To this day, it haunts me. The worst was pulling her out and swimming with the body as eels and fish followed us, occasionally picking on bits of flesh. I think there's something about being underwater. There's almost like a level of vulnerability because it's not our natural environment that could probably raise a little bit of anxiety, especially when looking for something so macabre. So thank you for doing what you do, but boy, tough stuff. Before COVID, I worked at a funeral home that wasn't particularly well run. I was a funeral assistant, and one of the embalmers was notoriously difficult to deal with. Her name was AJ. About 4 days before this story, AJ had picked up a deceased man who had died of septicemia and who was to be cremated due to the fact that he was already in a bad state on death. So AJ had the brilliant idea to leave this gentleman on the rolling cot for 4 days unrefrigerated, figuring it wouldn't matter since he was being cremated and it was a slow week. Of course, I got the job of moving him to the crematory with AJ. We walked into the embalming room and found that the decedent had bloated and was leaking a gray liquid sludge out of his urinary catheter onto the floor. If pestilence had a smell, it would have been this liquid. It smelled like a warning to the base lizard part of my brain. To describe this liquid as smelling bad is an understatement. The liquid was something you could feel and sense in the air. AJ and I donned our gear, and luckily, since they placed him on a cot already, we didn't have to do much in the ways of moving the body. Unluckily, the cot was relatively old, and one of the cot wheels had to be manually unlocked using hands, as the foot pedal was too rusted to effectively use. AJ told me to unlock it, and so I carefully bent down and unlocked the wheel. Well, AJ got the bright idea to shake the cot violently as some sort of prank, sending the gray liquid over the edge directly onto the top of my head, dripping down under my eye protection and mask. I closed my lips and eyes so the liquid running over them would stay out of my body, and calmly walked to the employee bathroom in a sort of numb state of shock. The funeral home owners saw my sludge appearance and sent me home paid for the rest of the day. Worked at a mortuary for a few years. We have methods to keep the jaw shut for viewing, otherwise it would gap open due to the angle of the head and neck. During a viewing, the device failed, and this gentleman's mouth literally popped open. The lead embalmer was not on site, so I did my best, ushered the family out of the room, and superglued his mouth shut. But he didn't have teeth, and supergluing just his lips did not work. It looked as if he was attempting to scream. I had to call in one of our other mortuaries in town, and that embalmer used a giant needle and thread to sew his mouth shut from under his chin to his palate. Here's a funny story from my grandma. She used to work in an ER in Puerto Rico. Some guy had passed away, and so the doctor came up to her and asked her to prepare the body to go to the morgue. So she gets some sheets and started to wrap this guy up. As she crossed his legs, suddenly his penis became fully erect and was straight up. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but it forced her to have to redo the sheets. So, as she uncrossed his legs, the penis went down. So she was like, all right, let's get this over with. Then she crossed them again. Lo and behold, the penis went straight back up. Tried one more time, and then she got freaked out and went back to the doctor. Obviously, he found this hilarious, as the guy apparently had a prosthetic in his penis. The creepiest thing is the effing curtain of flies and maggots blanketing the floor of an apartment where a woman had been decomposing in the hot late August, early September sun for 3 weeks before she was discovered. I thought it was dark in that apartment, but there were simply that many flies caught in the glass covering the light bulbs, on the ceiling, the floor lamp, the stovetop light. Every single light was covered in flies. The windows were dark with flies, dead flies, and even more flies that on the window panes. It was a horror movie. She was melted into the couch. When we tried to pick her up, her spine just fell outside of the rest of her body, and she ended up in pieces. I guess it's less creepy and more skin crawling, but I hate flies and maggots. Freshly dead I can deal with. Decomp in and of itself is fine, but the sight of those flies was just... I'm pretty sure I threw out the clothes I wore that day. I just couldn't. I worked at a funeral home for quite a while. When I first started about a month in, I was working a holiday weekend. Only people working were the transport guys and me. They came to drop off a body and went right back out. I thought they were still there and needed to ask a question. I walked into the embalming area and this dude was sitting up on the gurney looking right at me when I opened the door, and it literally made me pee a little in fright. Turns out the transport guys picked up the body from an area hospital. He'd passed away while in a slightly reclining position, and rigor had set in. They couldn't flatten him out. Still the scariest moment in my career, even if I got a little laugh out of it later. Human osteologist here. I work with dry human bones, so they don't have to do too much. But one of the times I've ever gotten the creeps was when I was handling a crania in the collection and could hear the wisdom teeth shaking around, partially formed but not quite erupted in the mandible. Wisdom teeth form around 18 years old and erupt generally in late teens or early 20s. I at the time was about 20 and my wisdom teeth were just coming through. I realized these remains belonged to a girl about my age. That's probably exactly what my skull looks like. It really humanized things for me. Attended a suspected fire once where we could smell smoke but couldn't locate the fire. Eventually located it, and when we entered the house there was an old woman slumped over on the floor. Tried to turn her over but couldn't. Turned out she had been laid on one of the old bar-type heaters, and because the heat was not allowed to escape, it had burnt a hole through the floorboards and the heater fell through the hole. However, when she was laid on it, her body fat started to melt and run into the floorboards. Then, when the heater fell through, she cooled. By the time we got there, she was one with the floor. 2 of us to get shovels under her to roll her over. It was years before I could eat smoky bacon flavor crisps again. I initiated compressions on my patient when she unexpectedly coded. About halfway through my first round, the patient pinked up, eyes open, turned her head and groaned. I stopped, and so did she. Turned gray and unresponsive, so I started compressions again. She woke up again, and I realized that compressions were providing adequate perfusion to her brain so she'd wake up, but her heart wasn't doing anything. I had to continue compressions and shock my patient, who was awake, groaning, and alert enough to know what was happening. I've coded countless patients without a problem, but this event gave me nightmares for some time. I used to be a med lab tech, 68K in the Army, and sometimes assist with autopsies in the hospital. We did one on an infantryman, Fort Carson, 4th Division, that I'd suicide by gunshot to the right temple. The round passed under the frontal lobe and just behind the eyes, so it barely skimmed his brain. The pathologist estimated that it took several minutes for him to die just because the location merely made him bleed out and wasn't instant. The creepy thing was because the round passed just behind the eyes and wasn't hollow point or anything that spread out, it snipped the back of his eyes, causing them to drain, so his eyes were kind of deflated looking on top of being very glossy, as a dead person's eyes are. It was weird and sad. I worked in an ICU and my patient had leukemia and lost pretty much her entire clotting system. Every place we had stuck a needle or pierced her anywhere for about the last week or so started bleeding and looked like thin ketchup. She had chest tube punctures, multiple IV starts, and every finger had multiple blood sugar sticks, and all of them were leaking red. She was only 19, so we were trying really hard to save her, trying to pump donor blood into her veins using pressure bags. Frantically, we worked, following the instructions at the lead of the code and moving so fast doing CPR and giving drugs, and blood was getting flung all over because you couldn't touch her anywhere without getting blood all over your gloves. In the end, she didn't make it, of course. The one little ICU room looked like a slaughterhouse with blood everywhere, floor, curtains, room divider curtains, ceiling, the monitoring equipment, and everyone that worked on her. I was a student nurse at the time and was working with the patient's nurse. I had to keep going out to get various things to help, and I kept passing by her newly married husband sitting on a stretcher, all alone in the hall waiting for news. I've never seen such a mess of blood in a single room since then.
It's never fun to read about a young person passing away, losing their life. And the description of that room is just horrifying. So, wow. Hope you're doing all right, and I'm sorry for all their losses.
Held a blood clot in my hand that killed a person. Maybe not creepy, but being in a medical examiner's office was definitely eye-opening. Two things that stuck out were watching an autopsy on a fat woman in her 40s, like 300 to 350 pounds. First, her skull was really thick, and it took extra passes with the saw to finally get through. Even the guy doing the sawing said something about it being one of the thickest he'd seen. Oh, and the way they cut the face off and peel it down to the neck was trippy. They cut her open, weighed all the organs, and finally got to the heart. It was a big one, again according to the ME guy, and he found the cause of death, a blood clot. He put it in my hand, and it was like the size of a ball in a ballpoint pen. Amazing, something so small can kill you. Then they brought out a body of a young 20s guy who had been sitting outside for a few days. Half his body was green, bloated, and I simply cannot put into words how bad it smelled. But when the swamps of Dagobah story is mentioned, that's the smell I think of. The guy was like a drug overdose, as there were no outward signs of injury. The smell was horrible, but the last thing I saw before I had to leave was them ramming a swab, long Q-tip, basically the swabs used to test for COVID in the early part, up the urethra. I know he's dead, but I still cringe thinking about that.